Hello, Pod Smashers of the Internet, and welcome to another episode of
Bit Podsmash.
Where Gaming Goes to Grab a Beer.
We are your hosts, Penguin and Termite. I'm Penguin.
I am Termite, and we are a weekly video game podcast smashing together ideas that you care about with video games.
That's right. Tonight, the idea we are talking about is source material and how source material affects the video game adaptations that are drawing from it differently depending on what kind of source material it is, and just generally the importance of source material on adaptations, and possibly discussing source material that isn't often used in video games. We'll get to all that and more, but tonight but as always, where gaming goes to grab a beer. So what are you drinking tonight?
I am drinking a Dogfish Head, to no surprise by anyone. They're new this year, seasonal. That's the word I was looking for. Seasonal beer, Festina Peach, or I don't know how to pronounce it. It's peach, but it's a different language. And it is according to their can, a tart and refreshing summer sour made with boatloads of peaches. And it is wonderful. Every single one of these peach beers that many breweries come out with always have like just a hint of peach that to me ruins the balance.
Right.
And it takes away from, this is a straight up sour peach beer in your face. If you're into sours and you like fruited beers and you like peaches, this is the one for you. It's awesome. And because it's 80 degrees today in April in Virginia, it is perfect for today's weather. Refreshing and tart. I love it. It's full of peaches. Dogfish Head doesn't really make any junk. So there's that.
Well, I made a mistake with my beer purchase.
Uh-oh.
And
you got a stout, didn't you?
No. I actually, ironically, I did get a stout in my most recent trip, but that's not what I'm drinking tonight. This is from my previous trip. I got this beer primarily because it has a fantastic pun as its name.
Nice.
But I'll just describe it and then I'll get to it. Blue Mountain Brewery. This beer is called Red Zeppelin.
Yep.
And it is a red IPA. And I got it. I knew it was an IPA going into it. I was hoping it would be like a red ale where it tasted more like a red ale and less like an IPA. But no, this is like so bitter. And I took a sip of it just now for the first time when we were, like after we said, yeah. And I'm like,
yeah.
Oh, I made a mistake. This is not. Sometimes you get IPAs and you're like, yeah, this is drinkable. This I'm gonna be choking down. I'm gonna drink it all because I paid for it. But yeah, I miscalculated on that one. But it had such a clever name, and I will go ahead and read the back.
Do it.
Gliding along on the invisible plane between the dimensions of malt and hop, Red Zeppelin is a sublime taste experience. Hopped hard and heavy with Falconer's Flight, Simcoe, Cascade, and Citra. Yeah, I probably should have read that description. Maybe I wouldn't have hopped hard.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not a description I like in my beer. Our listeners might notice I feel like I sound sick, and I am. So my nose is stuffed up. I got a cold from my son. I think that I haven't had a cold in general pretty much since the pandemic started due to all the social distancing and mask wearing. I can't recall a time that I got notably sick over the last year and a half. So I guess it's just my immune system being we don't know how to deal with these things anymore. But I got it for my son. He's been snotty and sneezing and coughing and just all around yuck for the past few days. And I thought I had already gotten the worst of it, but today it hit me like a truck this morning. And yeah, sometimes you're like, oh, it's just the morning. It's just after you wake up, your body's tired and it's having a hard time dealing with the fact that you're a little sick. But nope, as soon as the Tylenol wore off again, I was like, ugh. So I'm on Tylenol and caffeine and general stuff, but I'm pretty miserable right now.
Yep. It's like the spring cold season. It's going around because I just got off. I recovered from it, I don't know, 2 weeks ago. This would be week 3. And I'd just this past weekend noticed, it's been almost 3 full weeks, noticed I didn't have yellow phlegm coming out of my nose or coughing it. So it lasted forever. It sucked, but I just went through it too. So I feel you.
Yep. Yeah. Just kind of here. It'll be fine. I will bring the energy and then pass out.
Nice.
When we're done. So, but if I sound like I am stuffed up and talking through my nose, that is why. Just want our listeners to be aware. Anything you wanted to chat about before we jump into the episode that we're talking about?
I finally platinumed Horizon Forbidden West today. So that's done and over with. Nowhere near as frustrating as some of the other platinums that I had been dealing with this year so far, and that is namely Elden Ring and Wonderlands, which both frustrated the crap at me at one point or another. Horizon Forbidden West was like this nice, smooth, just glide down to a nice, easy landing. Platinum done. Check the box and move on. It was comfort food. It was delightful and wonderful. And we'll have I guess our live stream will have already happened by the time this episode airs. So you can check out our video review of that over at YouTube. And you can find a link to our YouTube page at 80bitpodsmash.com. That's our landing website. There's links to all of our social media outlets, and you can talk to us about all of the things you think about those games. So we'll give you a little more of a rundown later. But so I finished that. I have 73 platinum trophies now, so I feel pretty good. 9 for the year of 2022, which means my goal of 2 platinums a month is met with an extra in the bank in case summertime work travel stops me from being able to get anything on my Vita. So we'll see. But yeah, so I'm feeling pretty good. And I just kicked up Lego Star Wars Skywalker Saga because I'm a sucker and bought it because I didn't have any self-control. So retail therapy is a wonderful thing. Impulse bought it in person. I got a used copy at GameStop, and I had a $5 off coupon that was going to expire at the end of April. So I was like, discount from used plus $5 discount. I got $10 off total. So it was $50, and I don't feel too bad about it. So I fired it up today, and it is delightful so far. So yeah, that's where I'm at, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm working through Mass Effect 3. It's fun. I'm enjoying it. I got distracted by a non-video game form of entertainment activity for myself, and that has been slowing me down more than anything else. So it's not like I'm busy or anything like that. It's not like I've got another video game that I'm just preferring to play. Like, nope, I'm into Mass Effect. I'm enjoying it. I enjoy my PlayStations with it. I just have gone several nights this past week in preparation for our D&D game that I'm finally doing, which will probably come up later. And I just was like, I'm okay. Well, Mass Effect's taking a back seat to that, unfortunately. But I got to play some last night and make some progress. So I believe the platinum is achievable even within the last, well, you know what? I didn't realize it was the 25th. So maybe not. It may be my May platinum, but yeah, I'm getting through it, and it's fun. It's fun. I kind of it's won me over a little bit, at least at this point. I still think it's definitely the worst of the 3 so far. Not
Really?
mechanically, it's fine. Not mechanically, it's fine, but story wise, I'm just like, I'm invested because I've been invested, right? And I feel like that's probably how players felt when the game came out. Is like, I'm invested because I've already invested 2 games worth, and I want to see how this thing ends. But for some reason, I just feel like I'm not, like, I already feel like I'm going to be disappointed by the ending, which is, I believe, the general consensus of Mass Effect 3 when it came out as well. So that's okay. It's still good. It's still leagues beyond what BioWare has done in the last few years. So I'm kind of like, you think, oh, well, then you should be excited for Mass Effect 5 or whatever, Mass Effect 4. And I'm like, not really. I'm not really excited about it because I feel like it's just going to pale in comparison to Mass Effect 1 through 3. Whatever. It's still a good game, and I'm having fun. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to tackle next, though, in this impromptu What Are You Planning? I might play a little bit of Pokemon, finally, circle back around to that, since I never finished it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then
same here. I need to do that.
I might tackle Nier Replicant, but I don't know if I'm going to go for the platinum on it because it's like 70 hours, and I think I just want to like blast through I think I want to set myself up for it as a future platinum, but I don't want to like stress about getting the platinum. I think I might just go for the complete the story. There's like a trophy for the speed run, and that's one of the missable ones you get. So they recommend you do like it has to be completed in like less than 15 hours of in-game time. So I'm like, okay, I can blast that, knock that one out, get the main story, and then circle back around to it for all the trophy hunting later. So that's kind of my plan, loose plan right now. I also kind of on the side am thinking about maybe instead of Pokemon starting Bloodstained Ritual of the Night again on my Switch.
Ooh, yeah.
Now that I've got a taste for good side-scrolling platformers again, Metroidvania style. And other than that, like, yeah, it's kind of just like working through that backlog of games that I sort of amassed and
Yep. It's
from
backlog
last year.
season.
And yeah, exactly.
Everything's getting delayed. It's time to just catch up, see what you got, take stock, play something fun, or do something stupid like me and buy another new game when I have
which actually
a million.
now, especially with my, I feel like now, especially with my D&D kick here, now might also be a good time to sink my teeth into Divinity, Divinity Original Sin 2, specifically, as, you know, kind of considered to be the premier role-playing game, video game adaptation.
Yep. Relevant
and
to our topic tonight.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I might fire that up, honestly, again. Last time I tried to play it cooperatively, and though apparently it is an excellent game to play cooperatively, for some reason I just feel like I want to play it solo and be in control of my whole party as opposed to like share the responsibility with someone else. So who knows? We'll see. All right. Well, I feel like crap, but I'm rallying. I'm rallying.
All right. Yeah.
Oh, did you want to talk about real quick before we do our favorite thing? Do you want to talk about what we're doing this weekend, the two of us?
Oh, yeah. Well, by the time this episode airs, it will have already happened. So I hope that we'll have a follow-up next week when we record again. But what's going on is, if you are familiar with Colin Moriarty of IGN fame, who started his own company, Kind of Funny, in 2015, had a major dramatic expulsion from Kind of Funny and started his own brand called Last Stand Media. He now has a weekly PlayStation podcast called Sacred Symbols, among other podcasts in his family. It's why it's called Last Stand Media, because there's a whole suite of podcasts. There's multiple hosts, but Sacred Symbols specifically is having its 200th episode live in Richmond. I am getting Dan, and we're going there. I forced on him. I was like, I'm buying all the tickets. I'm buying all your food. I'm getting you there. No barriers. We're going. I will see Colin in person with his co-host, Chris Raygun and Dustin, and the three of them are going to rank the best or the top 25 PlayStation 4 video games. So it's going to be awesome. I can't wait to be a part of it. It's the first kind of expo sort of cross interest video game mingling situation that we've ever been involved with, because we've never gone to a con together. We've never gone to an expo together. So this is it. Like, we're going to go, and it's going to be super fun to be in like a sea of fans of gaming and just be around that environment and have good conversations, I hope, with folks. And I can't wait. Like, it's going to be sweet. So hopefully we'll have some fun stories or some fun accounts to bring back. Plus I can share, like, I'm sure it's going to be recorded on YouTube. It's the 200th episode, so it's the podcast, right? And it is the single most famous PlayStation podcast, and it is the single most grossing podcast on Patreon for video games. So he's doing really, really well for himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's going to be fun. I think just in general, getting out, and I just haven't done anything like this possibly ever. Like, I didn't go to concerts and stuff. So like, this feels
plays,
like
right?
the nerdy equivalent of this. Yeah, but plays, I don't know, it's a different crowd. And
you've seen musicals?
Admittedly, like, well, yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, that's fair. It's probably it's probably similar to that, all things considered, but and yes, concert goers, I recognize, are also different than a bunch of nerds listening to a live video game podcast. But I certainly have never been to like a live podcast.
Right.
Yeah,
same here.
So
yeah, what's it going to be like? Like, how interactive will it be, or how is like,
or not? And if not, like, will it be? Is it going to feel like the same experience watching a podcast as it is listening to one? Certainly, it's got some appeal because lots of podcasts do this kind of thing, so it must have some appeal. So I'm sure it will.
But it's also
fun,
a learning
just
experience.
Getting out and going to get beers and food and, you know, stay up late and be out on the town. Like, I think that'll be a lot of fun just to do again. I haven't done it in a long time. So yeah.
Thanks, pandemic. Yeah. And it'll be a learning experience for us, because I would like to do a live recording of 80-Bit Podsmash somewhere, like make that happen. And so this will just kind of like, we've seen how the professionals do it. It gives us some barometer with which to emulate whatever we want to do in our own scale and our own audience. So I'm also going to be taking that knowledge. I can't wait. It's going to be great.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Playing at the biggest stage in the country, 80-Bit Podsmash.
Yeah.
We'll be lucky to play at the biggest stage in the county. But all right, well, listening to or going, that hopefully will be our favorite thing. But
80-Bit Podsmash is our favorite thing.
The 80-bit Podsmash is our favorite thing. Cheer.
Whoa.
Oh, my stuffy voice. That's why I feel like it deserved a sneeze afterwards.
Oh, I see.
All right. What's your favorite thing?
Well, I have a bunch in competition with one another, but since we are doing this podcast together, a thing I did with you over the internet a couple of nights ago was the D&D, which you referenced. So, hey, family friendly podcast. We'll talk about the other stuff. We played a round of Dungeons and Dragons. And it was awesome. Had a blast. 5e specifically with friend of the show, Java Fiend, who guested on our show probably a year ago now, Ryan. So he jumped in. The three of us had a whole intro tutorial campaign, and it was an absolute blast. And we had a good time with it all. Lots of laughter, some drinks, and role playing.
Yeah,
it was a good time. Something different, like you said. With the going to a podcast concert, it's like something I haven't done that in eons, and I wish we could have been in person, but I had to go up and move a couple hours away, so here I am.
Hey man, I had so much fun doing it, even over. It felt like a weird mix of playing a role playing. It felt like a mix of tabletop and like I don't know, like almost like a raid. Like or like raiding or even just co-oping any video game. Like I guess that I've spent so much time co-oping with people over a headset that like it didn't feel that different. Like absolutely it would have been more fun in person. Playing Smash Bros in person is more fun than playing Smash Bros online. But if you can't get in person, then online is still fun, right? And I've got friends who I've like tried to convince to do this before, and they always say like, or they say no, it's not going to be fun if it's not in person. And it's just, I don't know, I think that's a silly notion, but hey, I also, there's no accounting for taste there, I guess. So it was so much fun, and I had fun, and I had fun preparing it. Right, it was a lot of work going into preparing.
You did a ton of work. Words cannot be expressed about how much work you put into it, how much time you've
which
sank
is why
into
I didn't
putting
play
it
as much Mass Effect. The good news is a lot of that time was because I'm new. I was spending time essentially figuring out what tools and resources to draw from. So in the future, hopefully, once I get this stuff down in the future, hopefully it won't be as exhausting. But yep, D&D 5e. It was definitely fun playing with you, but someone at one point had warned me, or it was either someone had warned me directly, or I had stumbled across this on DM Academy, which is a subreddit where people give each other, Dungeon Master tips. Someone had warned me that like they're like, beware of that player. There's almost always that player who is going to try to just push and break the game, like push the limits of what you will allow as a DM, and try to basically break the game. And I was like, certainly none of my players are going to do that. But you did. You pushed me, and I had to threaten to have your character killed by a bunch of shirtless men in order to get you to back down.
Was that at the beginning or the end?
The end. At the very end, I was like,
I didn't think that was a push. The beginning was more of a push.
No, the beginning was funny. I'm going to let you know right now. I was going to make it fail. Not because I was going to.
You had to.
Set
you had
unreasonably.
Yeah.
I know. I needed to get you down in that cellar.
Right. Yeah.
The funny thing too is that your entire plan would have still required you guys to go down in the cellar. Like, I want to paint you guys a picture. The premise was he had to, or I had to get them down into a cellar where they were supposed to be ambushed by rats. Now they had a chance of not being ambushed by rats if they went on down there and passed a perception check to look around. But it was an attempt to get them to experience the potential surprise mechanics, but it was all relying on chance. Nevertheless, a combat was sort of required to happen down in the cellar, and then it leads to something more cool, right? Like it's a mage tower. The rats came in because of a hole in the wall that leads to a mage tower where they get to discover secrets and a puzzle and stuff like that. You did break the puzzle though, as we already discussed.
Yeah, I did that. Yeah.
But Termite's plan when they came to this bar and the bartender was like, "Hey, I need you guys to clear out some rats." Termite's like, "All right." Our friend Ryan, who's playing basically Iron Man, he's like, "Go shoot your lightning chest blaster outside. It's gonna rumble the earth, and then I'm gonna go use my thaumaturgy spell, which basically allows me to haunt a room, and we're gonna scare the rats out of there, and then we don't have to do any work." And I'm like, I'm like, "Danny, when was the last time lightning like literally caused an earthquake when it struck the ground?" Ryan was like, that like ground is like the opposite. Like ground is designed to absorb lightning strikes, right?
And I was like, well, if you hit the wall, you can blow a hole in the wall. And then my thaumaturgy is the earth shaking, which rattles the rats. So in my head, it made sense.
I'm going to tell you, my plan was to have my bard character who was there offer to help too and play a song of rat scaring.
Ah.
And but then when you guys got down there and the rats attacked you, I was gonna have him say, "Wait a minute, did I play the song of rat scaring or the rat embravening? Oh, they're so similar."
That would have been funny.
Exactly. It's fine. We talked you out of the plan, and the game proceeded as normal. But no, I was specifically referencing the end where you were like,
I was trying to scare the
I want
gnome
150
into giving
gold.
me more money.
Now,
and I don't see how that was a
I
big
found
stretch.
out later, I talked to someone about it later, and they were like, oh my gosh, you way over rewarded them. I was like, what? And they were like, yeah, 150 gold in that game is a lot. 100 gold is a lot. And I was like, oh, whoops. So, yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. The overly generous gnome that you're like, no, you're the worst. I want more. So
More.
It was
Yeah.
funny, but it was how far you were willing to take this at 10 o'clock at night when we were already trying to wrap up. You're like,
Yeah,
I will fight every last person in this bar. And I was like, no, do you know how long it takes to set up combat? I didn't set this one up.
Yeah.
It's pretty funny. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, I guess I liked talking about D&D, and I feel like that was worth skipping DLC tonight for, if that's okay with you.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I don't really have
is
one
it okay with
planned.
our audience? That's what we
All
have
right,
to
let's
know.
ask them. All
And
right,
you
I'm gonna wait for
know,
everyone to respond. We're gonna sit here for how much longer do we have to record? We're gonna sit here for another 50 minutes listening for you guys to respond in just
I
complete
guess we
silence.
should be fair and tell them where they can find information about us. That's our landing website at 80bitpodsmash.com, and that has links to all of our social media outlets: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Reddit, and we have our Discord server up and running. In fact, we use Discord for our D&D session, and we use Discord for our live camera faces in our live streams, which brings up twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash. You can subscribe to us there, where we do at least a once a month stream. It's going to last about 2 hours. We should have just dropped one about our reviews of Wonderlands and Horizon. Most of these 2-hour live streams are going to be spoilery, but also it's Let's Play, so we're playing it as we're talking about it. And come join us there. Join us in chat. Hang out with us. Have a good time. And tell us all of your thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, and ideas over at 80bitpodsmash.com. There are also links to our other podcasting platforms. If you are listening to us on YouTube and want to know how else you can get to us, there's Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, of course, Google Play, and Apple Podcast links for your convenience, as well as an RSS feed you can plop into any third-party app of your choice. So hit us up.
Awesome. Well, let us, and go to all those places. And since we didn't have a DLC, I'll just say, tell us your D&D or tabletop role-playing experiences, or if you've never had them and want to have them, or if you've never had them and have no interest in them. We want to hear why you prefer video games, or if you just don't play any games and are like one of those super boring people who just like dedicates their life to like helping people, and getting fulfillment out of like bringing joy to the lives of people, then we absolutely want to hear more about that and your efforts. Even if I was just calling you boring, you're probably a really decent human being.
Fascinating.
Final last tiny little D&D related thing before we jump into our main topic, though. I just wanted to say I was genuinely shocked that neither you nor Ryan, huge Borderlands fans, the first time I said roll for initiative, you didn't say punch the initiative.
Oh, I don't even know that reference. Is that really what Brick says every time?
No, he doesn't say it every time, but he said
it just in Dragon Keep.
That. Yeah, at Assault and Dragon Keep, like one time he goes, punch the initiative. I was like, I expected one of you to say it. And now that I've said that, you're going to say it every time, and that's okay. I'll be okay with it.
Yeah. Yep.
It's still one of my favorite quotes. So. My siren's name is Brick, and she's the prettiest. All right. Cool. Well, tonight we are talking about source material and its effect on the video games that are adapted from it. So we did have a episode a while ago on video game adaptations and whether or not they were good and what it would take to make them good. And so this is sort of taking the other side of the coin, going to the source of video game adaptations to talk about games that are made from that source material and how it is different it should hopefully come together in a coherent topic. I like to think that I was in a coherent state of mind when I came up with this topic, but
I've
I'm not
got
quite
lots
sure
of
I'm in a
thoughts to share,
coherent
so we'll be good.
state of mind
At
now.
least
So
one of us, right? Yeah.
okay, good.
Yeah.
But first, let's kind of recap, I guess, and just sort of start. What do we mean by adapting a video game? What does it mean to adapt a video game? Let's not take for granted that people are familiar with the concept of source material, and we'll talk about what is source material, what are the different kinds of source material, and let's start there, and then we'll elaborate on the topic. I might throw a twist on that question as we go. But
Cool.
what does it mean to
So
adapt a video game?
we're talking about video games that are not the original IP, right? So
Exactly,
like
where the
not Final
original,
Fantasy, not
exactly right,
Dragon Warrior,
or
not Mario.
Zelda or God of
Right.
War,
Okay.
right? Any
You're talking
number
about
of
stuff like GoldenEye
right. Although
and
technically one could say that God of War is an adaptation of Greek mythology, but
that's
like
true,
that's the right, yeah, an original concept where the original game was the source material. It's its own source. It's a unique IP. No, we're talking about games where it was started as a book, and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Well,
Gotcha.
let's get into it,
There you
right?
go.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's the
so
sort. There you go.
right, exactly. So adaptation comes with its own it's its own kind of controversial thing, right? Like, there's a grand debate whether, in general, whether media adapted from other media whether it has artistic merit or whether it's sort of quote lazy cash grabs, right? Like, I mean, and we
Yes,
have
that depends on the implementation.
it totally does, right? But
Yep.
but there's still even just a general right now, and there has been for a while, like pretty much since Lord of the Rings was such a breakout hit back in 2001. Ever since that was just like, blew the world up, pretty much since then it's been like adaptations it's been nothing but adaptations, right? Or more and more adaptations have overtaken original IPs in cinema. And there's a big debate as to whether or not there's a creative bankruptcy in Hollywood, right? Because on the one hand, adaptations are going to have a built-in audience. There's going to be a built-in, like, you're guaranteed to make X amount of money from people who are going to see it just because it's the thing they love, whether it's good or not. And therefore, people are like, well, you're not really having to actually work at writing good stories, because you can just bank in on other things. But there have also been incredible adaptations, in the last 20, 30 years. So it's the Marvel Cinematic Universe has, for all intents and purposes, been a triumph. And it's all adaptations, right? But I can definitely see that, right? Like, when are we ever going to get a Matrix again, right? Like an actual, like, something that's as amazing original work as the Matrix.
Yeah.
I feel like that was the
Legendary.
last big, unique IP to come out of cinema. And I do think there's a good argument to be made that there is potentially a fear of that happening in video games as well, where it's like adaptations overtake the original IPs. And
Ooh,
that's kind of why.
That's the crux of this conversation, maybe.
No, it's almost a different conversation in and of itself, but
That's good, because I would disagree with that. But
I would absolutely disagree with that too, because it's not happening. I think
That's
that
true.
though there may be a fear of that happening, I feel like
that's not.
I think we sufficiently covered that in our adaptation podcast where we had originally talked about it. All things considered, the vast majority of video game adaptations, with a few notable exceptions, the vast majority of them are just not good.
Mhm.
Especially when you have like 3 adaptations deep, right? Like all those all the video games that are adapted from movies that are adapted from comics. It's like your adaptations of adaptations of adaptations.
Yeah,
Are just,
Mhm.
for the most part. Again, with a few notable exceptions. But that said, let's jump in then to what are some of the different kinds of source materials. And so first of all, what is source material, and what are the kinds of different kinds of source materials?
So to avoid the chain that you just talked about, where it's like adaptations of adaptations, we're talking about the OG new
source
IP.
materials.
So like source material. So if it's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, does it harken back to the TV show or does it harken back to the comics? So comics,
100%.
Right.
Yep, because that was the
we're
first,
talking about
right?
comic books, exactly.
Yep.
And then sometimes movies do have original IP, rarely, and sometimes
Matrix.
TV shows exactly have their
TV
own.
shows much more so have, in like these days, TVs where I think Stranger Things, Breaking Bad, right? Those are all completely original stories.
Mad Men.
There's a lot of. I do feel like the silver screen has inherited the actual artistic. What Hollywood should have been doing. Everyone moved it to TV, and And maybe it's
Mhm.
because it's less risky, right? But still, I think that like we're getting so much better new stuff out of TV than we ever got, or not ever, but than we have gotten in a long time out of movies. Sorry, go on. To movies,
Real life
TV.
events.
Yep.
Real life events
Historical
like war.
events.
How many
Is
World War
or it
II
just
video games do they have?
yeah.
Or Assassin's Creed's being based on, yeah.
Or I think mythology goes in there as well, right? Like mythological stories.
Mhm.
I'm still waiting for, we've had all these everything that we had, that adaptation gold rush, and you know what has not been adapted into, as far as I can tell, like a movie or video game or anything that's just I feel begging for it. The
Mhm.
original freaking story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's like the oldest document, the oldest
Huh.
historical like story. It's literally the oldest fantasy story. It's the oldest, in many ways, sci-fi story. It's a mythology story. It's one of the oldest texts they have out there. And it's never, as far as I know, been adapted into a movie or like some cheesy, crappy movie. I still want like Blockbuster. I still want to see that. I kind of want to see that. Or video
Yeah.
game, something. So that's there you go. There's your free idea for the day. Video game developers listening
You
to
heard it
this,
here first.
clearly
We just want our name
listening to
out
this
there.
podcast. Exactly. Yeah, books, novels, obviously, right? The Witcher was a novel series. If they ever get around to adapting any of Brandon Sanderson's works. What else is novel adaptation? I feel like there definitely are novel other ones out there, but I'm just completely blanking right now.
I mean, there was a
Oh,
Hobbit video
anything
game
Harry
that was
Potter?
not. Yeah, Harry Potter was
Yeah,
based on
anything Harry
books.
Potter.
Yeah,
Yep.
before the Hobbit movies came out, while during the Lord of the Rings video
Yeah.
games were all based on the movie, they had the actors and the actresses in there. But there was a Hobbit video game that was not that
Yes.
great that came out in that little
That was
stint
disappointing.
that was
Yeah.
based on on the book. So there's that.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I'm sure there
Um,
are more. We can Google it.
and then I mean, there's a slight difference between direct adaptation and like games that are just like that draw their inspiration from novels. But think about how influential games or books like 1984 were on, or Brave New World, on like so many video games that are set in like futuristic control, super authoritarian controlled environments. Like they're not adaptations, but books and novels have had a huge.
Yep.
Who would have thought that
There's
the nerds designing video games were like also well-read nerds?
Who knew? The Metro series, starting with Metro 2033, is based on an adaptation of a Russian novel of the same name.
Oh,
So
cool.
there's that.
Oh,
and
awesome.
BioShock isn't so much based on a book as it is the complete takedown of the philosophies in Ayn Rand's written works.
Oh, cool.
So that's an original IP, like
that.
derived. That's the word, derivative of
like
that.
a philosophical work.
Yeah,
That's cool.
which is interesting.
I did not know. I mean, I think I had heard that when you said it. It sounded familiar, but like it's not one that came to mind.
Yeah.
Cool, awesome. Comics, right? Like low hanging fruit right there. Comics and graphic novels, like yeah. One super colorful medium with colorful characters and heroic and violent and actiony. It's almost like it was made. The video games were made to adapt comics. Historical, or we talked about historical events, board games and tabletop games, of course, right? So many games that are not only are there literal like Risk video games out there, or
Monopoly.
right? Yeah, exactly. There are literal
There's so many
games that
Monopoly
are just
games. Yeah.
simulated versions of board games, but there are also like adaptations of those. Well, not all of those specifically, but like, I think there's a Gloomhaven game out there that plays a lot like Gloomhaven, but it's been video gameized, and then there's the games. We had a whole episode about games that were more or less inspired by D&D, but there are also games that are like legitimately trying to recreate D&D in a video game, aka Divinity Original Sin or the Baldur's Gate series. That's what their entire Baldur's Gate is set in the Forgotten Realms, which is the most popular and the biggest of the D&D multiverse worlds. So, those are all very much. And dude, the stuff I'm seeing coming out of Larian Studios for Baldur's Gate 3, I'm kind of tempted to grab it when it comes out of early access, like when it's finally officially quote unquote released.
Yep.
So
that might be the only PC video game that has gotten my attention since Portal. Like, yeah.
I will say, as much as for a second I wanted to lament the fact that it's PC only, I just considered that one of the reasons I put down Divinity Original Sin 2 was because I felt like it was clunkier on the PlayStation, and I kind of regretted my purchase and wished I had gotten it on PC.
Oh,
so I
really?
feel like that's true. Yeah. I had heard that, and I chose to ignore it, and then ended up agreeing with it on the back end.
Huh.
So, say Lovey. I would be thrilled. I mean, granted, I'm happy to play, obviously, and honestly, I would rather just play D&D with you guys, but there's a part of me that's like, I would be super happy if like you and my friend, our friend Justin and our friend Ryan and me were to get and like 4-player co-op, like Baldur's Gate 3. If I'm assuming it has co-op just like Divinity does, but all right, cool. And then finally, other video games can be adapted, right? Like you can make adaptations of other video games. I think of like Hyrule Warriors is a Warriors adaptation of the Zelda franchise, and think of all the various spin-off games, whether they're official or like a game comes out later, right? I mean, actually, speaking of Baldur's Gate, which is an adaptation of D&D, you could argue that Baldur's Gate 3 being a entirely almost like they changed up the battle system and stuff, even though it's within the same like continuity and it's within the same franchise, it's also almost an adaptation of Baldur's Gate games because it's made by a wholly different developer and it's got a different system, like it's got different systems in it. So I don't know, I would argue that it might even be an adaptation, but anything that's rebooted or anything that's just like freaking I'm blanking on examples, but I think of like cheap crappy like cash in freemium games and stuff that are based off of existing video games, like they're kind of adaptations of other video games, but I definitely think that that's a source material. And but again, this topic is about how like source material affects it. Like those games are going to be judged by their source material. How much does this capture the spirit of the source material being the previous video game? Yeah.
And you have like
So.
Gwent is a spin-off game based on the game inside of a game for The Witcher. And then you have it's kind of strange. The Skulls and Bones, I think, is the Ubisoft game that is the naval combat ripped out of Black Flag, Assassin's Creed standalone game. So like the source material is the original game it came from, but there's this other thing. There's a million like rhythm games from like Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy, Theater Rhythm. So like they're in that world. The Kingdom Hearts ones actually tell additional story. Then there's like the Persona 5 dancing games or the Persona dancing games 3, 4, and 5. So there's always like you said, the Hyrule Warriors kind of grab going back to Zelda and adapting that. So it is interesting, games adapting games.
Yeah,
I mean, I love. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but like think about how the source material of Hyrule Warriors affects that game versus the Dynasty Warriors games, which there's one that's based off of a kind of novel, right? Like it's based off the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is like a famous Chinese, I don't know if it was like officially a novel or if it was like a Chinese story, I don't know, but it was some kind of literature from China is what that was based off of. Very, very famous and historical, but like those games, like everything, sound effects, assets. So we'll actually dig into that as sort of a segue into our next question. So how do the different kinds of source materials translate into video games? And then a kind of twist on that question, I would say like a way to answer it, rather, one of the ways to answer it is to talk about how like, what do you think are like going through that list, right, that we just did? Like, what kinds of games are typically made from each of those, right? Like genres, I mean, like what do historical games that make a lot of great, real-time strategy games or whatever, right? Like those, you don't quite see that as often from books and novels, right? So like that's what I'm kind of getting at with that question is like what kinds of games tend to come from those source materials, but then also how do those source materials, like how do developers, what tools do they use to translate and make you feel the connection to the source material in those video games? And then the last kind of piece of that question is what challenges do games face based on having to adapt their source material? Like what is inherent about those different source materials that present different challenges depending on the source material? Big question, but it is the meat of our episode tonight. So
yeah, and there's like, this is where you go into the implementation determines everything, whether it's going to be even good or bad, because I'm looking at a list of all of the video games based on movies, and you can go back to Atari. There's like 1,000 of them from the 70s and 80s that are things, notoriously the extraterrestrial E.T., right? The Atari game that was just complete garbage, so much so that they buried him in the desert. Then there's like the early Star Wars games, which were pretty good, like the arcade first-person shooter flying through space section of Star Wars. Like just using those two examples. Well, in history, we had limitation on technology that also was at play with how much does the IP cost, and how does that affect the budget of the entire production of the game, and then how much resources can you allocate. So sometimes they take really cheap, easy games, and then they just throw the skin of the source material on it and call it a day. Kind of like what Super Mario 2 was with Doki Doki Panic. They just threw Mario skins on the core of the game, and it actually worked. But when you do that with like movies being thrown onto video games, it happens countless of times. And I remember, like, even as a kid in the 90s, there was just droves of Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo games that were just garbage movie there was a Home Improvement video game, folks. Like, what? And then there was a Home Alone video game and a sequel to it. And it's just all these weird, like, obvious cash grab games that were not that great. But then you have like some awesome side-scrolling Batman games. And it goes back to like technology limiting what they could do. So yes, Batman makes sense as a side-scrolling beat 'em up like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Batman Returns is awesome. If you haven't played that for Super Nintendo, go play that, or even Sega Genesis. But now we have, I think what you had mentioned, where in 2001 was the release of like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, and then like the X-Men trilogy after that, and like the early Marvel stuff, that every single one of those games or movies had a video game adaptation that were just garbage. Like, just come on. And then Lord of the Rings, they all had their tie-in video game. Even The Matrix had tie-in video games, and some of them are good, hit or miss.
Weren't bad, yeah.
Right, yeah. Some of them are actually pretty good, and like it all depends on what kind of, is this a video game built from the ground up using this source material, or is it just a copy and paste of assets from the movie or book or whatever, like source material copied onto an already existing game that's done.
Well, yeah, and
it's not integrated.
Sure, no. I think that, like, if you were to really dig, you'd find good and bad examples of both, though. I think what really, really sets it apart, though, is, and I think this is sort of the unifying answer to this question, is, well, it's the unifying answer, and then we can talk about sort of the differences and challenges that the individual types face. But it all comes down to, can you capture the feeling of the source material? Like the feeling that the person had when they were consuming the source material in whatever form it took the first time, right? And that feeling is going to be different in a novel that takes place mostly in your mind and words on a page than it's going to be in a movie where you have sound effects and you have visuals and you have stuff already built into it, versus historical events, which kind of also take place in people's imaginations based on actual, but then like our images are informed by actual like historical evidence. And so like things need to be accurate to the historical record and the evidence, because that's part of the experience, right? So do you experience the same feelings while playing the game that you experienced when you consumed that media, that source material, for the first time? And that, I think, is what makes or break it. So
yeah, and the translation of adding the player agency to what's going on is huge, because everything else is passive. If you're reading a book, the story's there. Your mind kind of fills in some gaps. Maybe there's some assumptions or some cool things you can draw from the lore, but then the movie is only 2 to 3 hours, hour and a half to 3 hours long, and so you're passively watching a movie, so you're only consuming what's presented in front of you. With video games, you are the player. You have agency here, and depending on what the developers give you, depends on how much you have, but it is different, because video games, the difference between video games and everything else is the I did this mentality.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of quoting Todd Howard this year. He was like the lead host of an award show earlier this year, and I can't remember what it was, but he said that thing and it was like inspiring. It was like, yes, you've nailed it. I did this. Like, I got a copy of GoldenEye 007 and I infiltrated the dam. I'm the one that snuck through, not James Bond, even though I was playing as that person. I am James Bond in this moment.
Sure,
so, like,
but like if you watch a Star Wars movie, you're like, wow, those Jedi are really cool.
Yeah.
The video game should make you feel like that cool Jedi.
Yep, exactly.
And so that's, yeah, so it's like if it fails on that point, and in many ways I think that therein lies a challenge, right? Like, when you put me behind the wheels of a character like Kratos for the first time, I don't know who this is. This is someone that I've never met before. I'm coming in with basically no expectations. I may be coming in with people telling me this game has been really good before, or this game is really good, but all things considered, I don't have an image in my head already of who Kratos is, other than maybe the cover art. And and a trailer I saw. So I'm getting behind him for the first time. It's like Project Athia, right? Like, or
Yep.
Forspoken. Like I don't
Yeah.
know this. I'm not. I just sort of like I've seen the trailers and stuff, but like. So I do maybe kind of expect it to feel a certain way, but like I'm not sitting there being like, oh man, this better feel like my favorite effing movie of all time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So therein lies the rub, and it's crazy how often they get this wrong.
What's super super difficult, and it goes into our challenge. Like,
Hmm.
one, the IP. If you're making a video game already is a challenge. Like, it's already expensive. It's already got its own hurdles. But then you throw on like a movie IP or a book IP or comic book, you got to pay royalties to the source material as well, which does affect your budget, which does affect how much you can
The
put
end
to
product,
making a
yeah.
good game. And so, like you were talking about earlier, how much does the video game integrate with the source material to make you feel like that cool Jedi, to make you experience what it's like to be a ranger in the Lord of the Rings world, like Middle Earth, Shadow of War, and Shadows of Mordor. Like, those types of games do it well. And there's I think we could do an entire podcast, a whole new podcast with weekly shows for years about Star Wars video games, because there's so many of them, and so many that do it right and so many do it wrong. But the ones that do it right, most recently, is Jedi Fallen Order, where you are a Jedi and it's awesome to play as, and it's challenging, exploration, different, like all those things make you feel the same emotions that you would get from the movie. But it's so difficult to get that right. And because if you fail, it quickly becomes a cash grab so fast, and then it's just dismissed and it's review bombed into into a dark pit and never heard from again and buried in a desert somewhere like ET. And so
Yeah.
it seems to be like a fall off of a cliff. Like, if you give us a new IP, a new game with like you mentioned Forspoken, right? Completely new IP. The game is going to be a hit or miss with a lot of people, but it's never going to be a cash grab, because there's nothing to like to put it in that field of
It
like, oh,
might
this is a
be a
cash grab.
cash grab, but for different reasons, right? It might be
Yeah,
a cash grab
exactly.
if it's cheaply made and overhyped,
Right.
right?
Yep.
Like it
Yep.
might be a cash grab if they're like, we attached Amy Hennig and Gary Whitta to it in order to like sell it, right? Like that, those ways it might be a cash grab, but it's not going to be a cash grab because it's just trying to ride the coattails of a more successful IP. At the very least, they're
Exactly.
trying to write something new. No, I got you there. Let's talk
Hmm.
about the individual challenges that each of the individual source materials face when it comes to video game adaptations. I'm actually going to tackle the first two together, though. I don't know what's worse, what's more difficult though. Competing with uh like the already well established images and sounds and feelings that are like present in a movie, like a massively successful movie franchise like Harry Potter um or Star Wars. Uh Again, admittedly Harry Potter, but Harry Potter already making quote successfully making the translation, the adaptation from the jump from book to movie, then the video games tend to be adapting the movies with all the same music and stuff. Like, I don't know if it's more difficult to take that, like all the assets, and try to translate all of them into a video game, or if it's competing with people's imaginations in books and novels, right? Like, because the thing about books and novels, I feel like the biggest challenge that adapting books and novels, aside from trying to like properly, render with computer graphics someone's imagination. I mean, the movies suffer the same problem when
Yeah.
adapting a book to a movie. But I
Hmm.
think that the other problem with book to video game adaptations is the aspect of like you have to adapt the spirit of whatever the theme is, because books more so than movies tend to really like be thematically sound, right? Like movies tend to be more about spectacle than theme, but books are like all they have is the words on the page, so those words are usually trying to convey a message as well through the text. And so it's like you have to like, also you can't like, when you're adapting a video game from a book, you can't undermine the message of the book, or else your adaptation will probably fail, right? Like if
Hmm.
something about your game is, if the book is about anti-violence, and maybe perhaps the author is using a very violent world to demonstrate the problems with violence, and as a treatise on why violence is not the answer, and yet they do so through a really gory, bloody, brutal book. If they make gory, bloody, brutal book the game, and that's all it is a vapid like slaughter, it's like you miss the point. So I feel like that danger is
Right.
probably the biggest problem with like, or difficulty challenge that adapters have to face
Hmm.
when trying to choose novels or books as their source material.
interestingly enough, that falls on like the writing team,
Uh-huh.
which makes
Kind
sense,
of.
right? Because books are written. So the writers behind the video game, and that goes back to what we were saying about how is this a cut and paste of the source material onto an already existing game, or is this good writing met with good game mechanics from the ground up together, like woven to make sure that the theme matches, to make sure
Kind of,
it's
but
represented
writers in
correctly.
video games have the problem of, or have the difficulty of also having to work with the gameplay designers who have
Right.
potentially a
That's
different
a challenge.
agenda,
Yep. Yeah.
right? They're like, we want a big, brutal, bloody arena in brutal, bloody video game, the video game adaptation, right? Like, and the writers might be like, well, the book is about anti-violence, right? And they're like, yeah, but we really want to design this, right? Like, and you know what? Sorry, we already have designed it, so it's your job to make it work, right? Like,
Right. And that sounds
it's
like
like,
the publisher getting involved in the conversation saying, we've already allocated, $100,000 to this arena.
but
This
it's
needs to
not
be in
just the
your game.
publishers; it's the developers too, right? Like
Yeah.
the people. It's a different team of people with different skill sets who make the game mechanics, and
Mm-hmm.
in a good functional development staff, there is a great collaboration, right? That happens,
Exactly.
and everyone
Yeah.
sort of unifies behind
Mm-hmm.
the vision. But like, I think there are plenty of games that like the writers were almost sabotaged by the writing staff was sabotaged by the gameplay team, or the gameplay team was sabotaged by the writers, one way or another. I think of like, I mean, even a great example of like Anthem, right? Like, it's like incredible game mechanics, crappy writing, and it's like,
Yep.
it sounds like the disconnect in many ways like happened because the two teams didn't have unifying vision, so they were just kind
Very
of doing
much
their own
an
thing.
EA problem,
Yeah,
forcing Frostbite, and that's not
I
connecting to
know,
the
but it
BioWare
sounds like,
writers at all. And
remember,
like,
we've all heard the story though. It sounds like BioWare could not get behind a single vision, right?
that's
They
true.
could
Yeah,
not
they were
get behind a
fragmented.
unifying
Yep.
vision,
Yeah.
and that's not an EA problem. That was a BioWare problem. So yeah, I mean, it goes to show just how important it is that collaboration happen.
Yep.
Talking about comics, I think that like comics suffer from the difficulty of like, if it's a brand new comic, it's going to have too little material to draw from. And so if you're trying to like jump off the hype of like a super popular brand new comic, if it's not already an established world, if it's like a brand new superhero or a brand new wholly different story, it's like, okay, well, you're going to have like maybe 3 issues to work off of. So when do you make the video game? By the time you make the video game, if you're doing it right off the bat, there's probably going to be several more issues out. And
Lots. Yeah.
right. So, or so do you do that, or do you like wait until it's glutted with stuff and then you're never going to be able to like ever adapt all of it? I don't know what the answer is, but I'm assuming that's a big challenge in adapting comics, is like where to start with the source material. And what if it's got like multiple, what if you're like, trying to adapt a Spider-Man game and there's 18 different like Spider-Man reboot worlds? Which one do you choose? Or do you do what Insomniac did and just make your own, but also are like, again, just adding to the already convoluted continuity? If you're like, man, I love that story where Spider-Man fought Doc Ock, you're like, okay, which one? Are you talking about Spider-Man
Yeah,
2, the movie? Are you
so
talking
many.
about Spider-Man No Way Home, the MCU movie? Or are you talking about which Spider-Man video game of the many of them are you talking about? Or which Spider-Man comic of all of them are you talking about? Like comic run. So yeah, I feel like it's just like, it's probably like a challenge to where do we start and with which continuity do we start? Because comics tend to be convoluted like that.
Comic books give you all of the visual flair, though. So you have
Yes, they do.
how
It's
the
an
characters should
advantage.
look. When you talk about like character design and their silhouettes and their actions and how they are and their personalities, like it gives you more. I mean, I know like books and novels give you personality, but there's no visual aspect of that. Movies give you a total visual, but movies almost handicap the animation team or some of the costume design or some of the visual themes going on with some of the
They're almost
photography and like set
hamstringed by like,
pieces.
we have to make
Yeah.
this look like the movie, as opposed to a comic where it's like, it's just on the page, so you can animate it and make choices in how it moves that movies sometimes can't, and often feel stiff as a result. So yeah, I agree with
Yeah,
that.
I think comic books offer the best of both worlds. It's the visual aspect added to the thematic writing behind the characters and personality that give you the best foundation for an awesome video game.
Yeah,
I just
no, I agree.
throwing
I agree.
throwing
Comics
that
have a
opinion out there. I mean, it's
great
probably unfounded,
no,
but that's
it
my
is
opinion.
not at all. I feel like
Yeah.
that's why we see so many games based off of comics. That said, I do think we tend to see games based off of comics that succeed off of usually a very specific kind of like genre of comics, and that's almost always superhero comics, right?
Right.
Like comics, as most comic fans would tell you, are like, or graphic novels are, I think people will often point out, there's more publishers of comics out there than just Marvel and DC, believe it or not, right? Like Dark Horse
Mm-hmm.
Comics, and there's all kinds of like other publishers out there. But the only ones that ever get talked about are Marvel and DC, because the absolute most popular comics out there have been and maybe always will be superhero comics. And those, I think, tend to be adapted into video games, whereas like other really good comics out there might face the same problems that like novels do, in the fact they're very deep, very like gritty and dark, and or like super experimental and weird. And like you'd think that, again, there are plenty of video games that do both those things too, but I just don't know why they don't get adapted. So, or maybe it's good that they don't get adapted so they can stay cool and hipstery. I don't know. But historical events, they have the same problem, or that we already kind of talked about that. The problem is like verisimilitude is super important, because the minute you start to take liberties with the story is the minute people are going to rightly pick it apart, and
Mm-hmm.
there's room for that. Obviously, it's an adaptation. It's supposed to be fun. It's a video game. It's supposed to take some liberties. But if you take too many liberties, it borders on absurdity. So, board games and tabletop games, I think these tend to actually be, also alongside comics, tend to be some of the better, stronger adaptations, depending on the board game or tabletop, just because they are games, right? Like the mechanics are handed to you, and you just have to find creative ways. But like, again, we talked about the legacy of D&D, and just like so many games have taken the basic foundation of gameplay mechanics from D&D and done so many amazing, innovative things with them, right? Like, and just think of how different a game like The Witcher adapts the foundational principles of D&D versus a game like Baldur's Gate 3, right? It's like, yeah, or even Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, like that takes the dice rolling and does something fun and different with it, right? Like, so it's so many different varieties, and many of them still make you feel like you're playing D&D, and I think that's a triumph. RPGs, the entire RPG genre, is a triumph thanks to adaptations of D&D.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much D&D is the root of all of those things. That makes total sense. Even
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings takes
Yeah.
from D&D. But anyway.
And I mean, honestly, like I think about too, like even games like even video games that were based off, like that are some way, shape, or form based off of just even simple games like chess or checkers. Not that chess is simple, but right, the strategy. It's like, I do feel like there are games that just do that super well, that adapt that super well. Sometimes they're adapting the straight actual rule set, like 3D chess and stuff, or sometimes they're just inspired by it. But I do feel like that they, that's another shoe in. But of course, they come with the problem of being either too simplistic, or more like this is a fun kind of novelty to do it in a video game, or on a computer. But I'd rather just play the board game, right? Like, there's definitely that aspect of like you're certainly competing against the experience of the physical game, and there are very few other than games inspired by tabletop. There are very few like board game adaptations that have like ever won any awards or accolades, right? I can't think of any off the top of my head, except for maybe like, like Tetris, you could see as kind of like probably inspired by by board games, or some kind of physical game. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, puzzle games come from some
Yeah,
physical
puzzles.
inspiration. Yeah, so crosswords, even stuff like Blocus. Blocus is probably inspired by Tetris, which is a video game adaptation of a board
Ooh,
game. All the way
Wordle.
around.
Wordle is in many
Wordle
ways
now. Yeah,
kind of like Scrabble.
Scrabble.
Right?
Yeah, and so like. Yeah, of course, video games are going to be derived from like physical things. And puzzle games are interesting in and of themselves because puzzle games are almost always original IP, but the mechanics behind them are derived from some sort of actual checkers, chess, Scrabble type word manipulation puzzle gotcha games that started all the way back in like the cavemen days. So yeah.
Or like, I think of games like Tetris or Candy Crush, even essentially in many ways are from games like Connect 4. Maybe not Connect 4 directly, but games where it's about lining up the right colors of things, or in the right order and the right amounts, right? Like those kinds of games where it's about like dropping things in a certain way. I don't know, maybe Connect 4 or maybe Tetris predates Connect 4, I don't know, but like I imagine there are games that Connect 4 was inspired by, that Tetris was also inspired by. So
Hmm.
cool. What? Real quick, this question shouldn't be super long. Is there any source material that you've not seen adapted well or at all in video games that you think has potential to be adapted well? I mean, I was racking my brain to think of any kind of like major
Well, you
source
have the
materials that haven't
Brandon
been tried.
Sanderson stuff that hasn't been done yet, but he's in the works with that. And there's actually been like quoted in saying it's something is coming. So
Well,
we don't
sure.
know if it's
So
Mythborn, but
the
Stormlight
source.
Archives or whatever. But
Right. I think I wasn't thinking specifically of specific source materials. I was thinking of
oh,
big genre, big categories, right? Like, is there anything that you can think of that like would count as a source material? It could be like a subgenre of like a source material genre, but something where it's like, yeah, I've not seen many historical events, adapted well, or I've not seen any blank, right? Like I've not seen any religious texts adapted at all. And I think it would be interesting to see an adaptation of this religious text, right?
right.
Something like that, I guess.
I
Would
mean,
be
there's the Bible. Anything video game related to the Bible is now a trope and made fun of as a meme, like immediately. But if you
yeah.
actually look at the stories in the Bible, there's so much there you could make amazing games out of all
Dude, if
types
you're
of
talking about
genres.
like the holy trinity, not holy, the unholy trinity of video games being like sex, violence, and like,
It's all in the Bible.
well, think of like King David. Like if they did an adaptation of the life of King David, where you've got
It'd be
like
nuts.
you've got the underdog. Obviously, we get the term David and Goliath from it, right? Like you've got the underdog rising up and challenging, becoming the king, and then as king, he was like a conquering hero that like was a warrior poet and super like you get a good actor to portray David and a good animation team, good writing staff, and then you got all the romantic entanglements that he had, and boom, you got like the next God of War just waiting for you. I've
Yeah.
always thought that King David's life would have made a really interesting video game, and obviously you can depending on the developer. Well, it would be an absolute flop because it would be like Bible Man, the video game, if they got too religious with it. But I feel like if you were inclined, you could make it as religious or not as you wanted, or at the very least put some kind of interesting message in there.
Hmm.
Right? Like some kind of interesting I mean, even just the very notion of adapting that in sort of as it's presented, right? Like the closer you get to the actual what the biblical text is saying, like there would be a statement in and of itself of people being like, you'd have Christian parents be like, I bought this game for my child and it was so violent, and it was like,
Oh, it'd be awesome.
you
Yeah, let's do that.
don't
Yeah.
understand what the actual text is saying, do you?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, I'm
So
saying like I only mention the Bible because like as a cisgendered white dude who grew up in America, like that's the only religious text I've had exposure to. So I was just using that because you mentioned religious text, but to do it alongside of any other religious text, like there's no religious text video games, and I don't know if it's because it would be taboo in culture to misrepresent them, and so much so that you could offend great swaths of people, and therefore it's a market risk, and it will never happen. But
yeah, that's
also,
probably
like
it.
that's probably why it's never happened, and that makes total sense, and I get it. But so I don't want to be like show any sort of like exceptionalism to any of the other texts. To me, they're all equal, and it would be awesome to see any sort of video game source material come from any of them. But
You see,
I
and
thought I'd
that
throw
is
yeah,
yeah, no,
the
well, and you
caveat out
see
there.
that is an unfortunate side effect. We had an episode on capitalism at Christmas. That's an unfortunate side effect of video games inherent, like the industry's inherent tethering to capitalism, because it has to be market viable. It
Right,
limits the actual like possibilities, because you can't get that super risky but possibly super innovative
right.
game that could be adapted from the Quran, because if you
Yep.
did it wrong or offensive in any way, you're gonna get a bunch of people who want to kill you, right? Like, just because people get a little crazy about religion, right? Like,
A
far too
little,
many
just a little.
wars, far too many wars have been fought over whether or not you should sprinkle a baby's head with water, right? Like when they're born, right? Like, it drives me crazy, and that's criticism of my own religion. It's like people killed one another for centuries
Mm-hmm.
over the question as to whether or not to like sprinkle a baby's head with water.
Yeah,
It's
they
insane.
get a little crazy.
uh,
They get a little crazy.
but if you were to untether, like, I mean, again, it would still be criticized, and there would still be vitriol and hatred and lots of discourse over it, but like there was vitriol and hatred and discourse when Copernicus said that the Earth revolves around the sun, right? Like that is how progress happens, is by making bold, using whatever mediums you have available to make bold statements and big messages and about, again, deeply held convictions in order to challenge people's thoughts on them and get them to think. And video games are capable of doing that. I've experienced that in the video games we've had. And I would love to see more of it, but you're absolutely right. It would not be doable in our society right now because it would never be seen as market viable. So,
and this is a good segue, because keep all of that thought in mind about how market viability and offensiveness is another thing with which to draw source material from that doesn't get as much is modern events that happen in the world. And the example here is 6 Days in Fallujah. After the announcement of the game, it was met with major criticism by war veterans from the UK and from everywhere. Like the entire video game industry is just up in arms about the 6 Days in Fallujah. It's apparently a game that's about politics, something for politicians to worry about. No, it's not. They're worried about like what actually happened on the ground in Fallujah, not the relevance of whether the United States should have been there when it happened. But anyway, it's a gruesome like war game, and I guess it's still in development. But every time it comes up, it's just like pitchforks and tiki torches, like from everyone, from all over the place. It's just this and it's getting nowhere as far as like market viability, because now it's ridiculously risky to even make because so many people are up in arms about it. If you want to know more about like the content of the game, what it is, and the historical event that happened in which they're trying to portray, you can look that up. I don't know those details. You probably gained by the fact that I like stuttered over half of the description of what the game was, but it is like a Call of Duty-esque kind of game that's like modern warfare, but based deeply on a real life situation that's extraordinarily sensitive. Is it going to tell a creative story? Absolutely, because this stuff is real life, and there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, soldiers from all around the world representing all the different countries that all have stories to tell when these things happen. And getting those out into the light, I think, is a good thing. But capitalism and offensiveness and politics all kind of get in the weeds of that. So that's yet another. There is a lot of games based on like World War II and World War One and Vietnam. And yes, there's a ton of like exceptionalism and one-sidedness to the way that those stories are represented and who's winning, who the bad guys are, and how they're portrayed in the game. And all those can be deeply offensive from all over the place. But that's how sticky and nasty real world life stuff is. And I would wish that there's more of it to show and flesh out all the different sides, all the different aspects from everyone. And I think that there's a lot of actual humanitarian good that could come out of that. Understanding someone else's perception or perspective about how a situation went down could like bridge gaps in understanding if we had that, but we don't. And that's yet another untapped reservoir of source material for video games.
All right. Last question. With all this in mind, with all these difficulties of adapting and the different baggage that each source material brings, do you think that a video game developer is wiser to invest in adapting existing content, existing source material, or do you think it's better to just do something originality?
We had a whole episode about this.
I know. We're bringing it back. We're bringing a quick question, bringing it back with this new information in mind, or this new discussion.
Well, the answer is not really new, but it's capitalism, which we also did an episode about, and it's the risk over reward, or the return of investment.
I'm not
saying
risk
and reward.
Should. I'm not saying should in regards to how much money they will make. I'm saying, do you think it results in better games? What do you want? Do you want more originality or do you want more adaptation?
Ooh, that is an interesting flavor of the question. I think I'm 50-50 on that, because there's been enough really, really good adaptations of things that I love dearly, and there's been a lot of original IP that I love dearly, and I don't think the source material affects how good a game is. Like, if you just boil it down to that, like there's no way to boil it down to that or oversimplify the question. But if we were to just look at two games, one's original IP and one's not, and they're both amazing games, they reviewed really well and they're critically acclaimed, they're both awesome. But you do the same thing with two bad games. So it's almost like the source material itself isn't really deciding whether the game is good or not. It's all the other things we talked about in this episode. So personally,
I think that
flip a coin.
Yeah,
I don't really care. Yeah.
I think that, again, I'm probably going to almost always say original. I think that obviously there are plenty of examples of either that are bad, but in my final analysis of the game, when I fire it up for the first time and I'm looking at the thing, if you are adapting a lightsaber, I'm immediately going to begin nitpicking your choices in adapting that lightsaber. What colors does it have? Which version can I get? Dual lightsaber. Oh, but you left out the cool Count Dooku handle. Oh, but you left out the cool.
That's cool.
Blah blah blah. Or this color. Blah. Like, I'm going to start nitpicking. Instead, if you were doing something wholly original that drew its inspiration from Star Wars and said, I'm going to do spacey laser swords, but they're going to be a wholly unique thing. I'm going to instead say, oh, wow, that was so cool. It was like lightsabers, right? You know what I mean? Same thing. It's essentially going to be, again, but it's just the fact that it doesn't look like lightsabers. It legally cannot look or sound like a lightsaber.
Right.
But therein, it allows them to it forces them to make different choices. And even if I'm not going to nitpick those choices. Instead, I'm going to say, that's cool. It gave me the same feeling that a lightsaber gave me the first time because it's something new and original and different, right? Like, and that's ultimately, in my opinion, we need to be rewarding originality. I would love if the market was able to reward originality again, but I think that artistically, like, very few of the, like, my favorite games over the last several years have been games that were like adaptations of other content, right? It's almost all been, again, it could be the newest one in a franchise that was originally a new IP, right? But it's almost all been stuff that video games that were designed to be video games first. So yeah, that's kind of, again, there are exceptions, but for the most part, it's, if you look at the list, if I pulled up my top 10 here, I guarantee you most of them would be video games that were video games first. So, all right, well, that is our conversation. What do you think about source material? What are some source materials we missed? What are some great games you think did the source material well? What do you think about the challenges that each source material faces? What are your thoughts? We want to hear all of it. Tell us what you think, and Termite will tell you where.
Tell us why you think the Die Hard trilogy for Sega Saturn is one of the best video game adaptations from a movie ever by going to 80bitpodsmash.com. And that's our landing website where there's links to our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, and Twitter that give you the link, the directions. You can interact with us. You can ask us questions. You can post a comment. You can share our content with your friends and family and coworkers and anyone else, your neighbors, and tell everyone about this cool little podcast that's going on over here in Virginia that shares a different little window into the video game world that's a little bit different than the rest of the podcasts out there that follow the news and do the fun things. Hopefully we're different enough to stand out, and I'll let y'all be the judge to do that. So you can also find links to our other podcast platforms, Spotify, Google Play, and Apple Podcast, among others, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. And you can find all of the information, our comings and goings, over at 80bitpodsmash.com. Also, don't forget about our Twitch channel, twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash, where at least once a month we will be live streaming for about 2 hours and reviewing games. We should just have launched a Horizon Forbidden West and Wonderland Spoilercast review, and that will be in video format. We will spin it off in audio as a bonus episode as well as Twitch, but if you want to be involved in chat, hit us up live while the thing is happening. Follow us there so you can be made aware of when our May live stream is going to come, and you can be made aware of what game we're going to review. Don't forget, we have weekly episodes that launch every Monday around midnight. It's supposed to be midnight. Don't worry about what happened a couple weeks ago when an episode dropped at like 5 in the afternoon. But midnight, over 5 years of doing this podcast, I think I have missed midnight twice, but it's never been more than a day late. So, yeah, that's us. 80bitpodsmash.com, 80bit podsmash. So go check us out.
Awesome. All right, next week, every time I've seen this on the list, I keep reading it as my brain translated it as role-playing games, and I'm like, we have done that too much. Why does it keep showing up on the list? But then I reread it and I go, oh, it says replaying games. So what is your criteria or your approach whenever you decide to replay a game, which is an entirely different topic than a role-playing game? So why do you decide to play a game again? Replay a game,
Sounds
repeat,
fun.
play.
Yeah, it's gonna be a good
We're gonna
topic.
talk about that. It'll be a fun one.
I like it.
it.
Grab a beer and come join us, or a drink,
Yeah.
or whatever, a tea, a coffee, a water, something. Come hang out with us.
See you then.
See you next week.